My name is Brandy Wilbanks, and I am 34 years old. At a family dinner, my brother looked at everything I had built and called it pocket change, and the whole table smiled like he had said grace. My mother covered her mouth and cried, "Please, you two, stop fighting," the way she always did, right on cue. I didn't argue. They didn't know I had stopped fighting years ago and started listening instead. So I set one thing on the table, and I looked her in the eye. What they found out in the next few minutes is the reason I'm telling you this at all. But to understand it, you have to go back more than 20 years to the first lie I ever believed. I want to be precise about that dinner, because precision is the only thing that ever protected me in my family. It was Mother's Day, 2025. The table was full. Cousins, an aunt, two of my mother's friends who came every year to watch her be adored. My mother had spent the afternoon reminding everyone that she'd been hospitalized that winter and might not have lived to see another Mother's Day, turning every expression of concern back toward herself. And when the room was soft and grateful and hers, she looked down at her plate and she said, in that trembling voice she could produce on demand, that I had come into some money lately and turned my back on the family, that I thought I was better than them now, that I'd said cruel things about my brother. She let it land. Then she looked up with wet eyes and asked us, please, to stop fighting. My brother Travis was sitting at the far end of the table. He set down his fork. He looked at me the way I'd seen him look at me my entire life, cold, closed, disappointed. And he said, so proud of herself over her pocket change. The relatives smiled, not cruelly. That was the worst part. They smiled like it was a family joke everyone was in on, like Brandy being reduced to nothing was just the weather. My Aunt Colleen looked at her napkin. My mother touched her chest and let out a small sound, as if her children's cruelty was breaking her heart in real time. I didn't defend myself. I'd learned a long time ago that defending myself was how she won. So I reached into my bag and I set one small thing on the table, right next to the salt, and I looked at my mother and I said, let's end this act, Mom. What happened next only mattered because of everything beneath that moment. So before I press play, I need to take you back more than 20 years to how my mother taught two children to hear cruelty in words the other had never spoken. My parents divorced in 2004 when I was 13 and Travis was 16. By then, the first small misunderstandings between Travis and me had already begun, though neither of us knew who was creating them. My father, Gary, moved 2 states away, and within a year, nearly everything Travis and I believed about him came through our mother. My mother told that story often, and she told it well. She would sigh at the kitchen table and say she'd never speak ill of him, and then she would speak ill of him for 20 minutes, gently, sadly, as though the truth just kept slipping out against her will. He abandoned us. He didn't call because he didn't care. He sent a birthday card late because that was who he was. I believed all of it. Why wouldn't I? She was the one who stayed. She was the one who made dinner and signed the permission slips and cried at the sink when she thought we weren't looking. When the only person telling you the story is the person taking care of you, you don't check the story. You just live inside it. I understand now that my father was the first person my mother erased, but he wasn't the last, because there was a second story she was telling, quietly, in 2 different rooms, to 2 different children. And it took me 2 decades to hear both halves. Here is how it worked. She rarely lied in a way you could challenge on the spot, and that was what kept her safe for so long. If anyone had asked, "Did you tell Brandy that her brother hated her?" she could have said no, and sounded completely truthful. She didn't say it. She implied it. She sighed it. She let it live in the space between her words. I would come home upset about something small, and she would say, "Oh, honey, You know how your brother is. I don't want to tell you what he said about that. It would just hurt you." And then she'd change the subject and leave me alone in my room to fill in the blank with the worst thing I could imagine. She never had to invent the insult. She just handed me the shape of it and let my own fear do the work. The year before our parents divorced, when Travis was 15, he saved up and bought me a bracelet for my birthday. I remember it because of what happened when he gave it to me. Before Travis could give it to me himself, my mother took the box, placed it in my hand, and said quietly so he could hear it as almost kindness, "He got you this. He wasn't going to, but I made him. Don't make a big thing of it." I looked at Travis across the room, and he was watching my face, and I gave him the flattest thank you I could manage because I thought he'd been forced. His face closed. I thought that was contempt. I know now it was hurt. He'd used his own money, and he'd watched his sister receive it like a chore. There was a night I've never been able to forget. I was 17. I was crying in the kitchen over a college rejection, and Travis came in and stood in the doorway. And for a second, I remember this so clearly. He almost crossed the room to me. He took a step, and my mother came in behind him, stepped between us, and put her hand on his chest and said, "Not now, Travis. Let me handle her." And she steered him out. And she sat with me and stroked my hair and told me he'd only come in to see if I was making dinner, that he didn't like it when I got emotional, that I shouldn't take it personally. Again and again, when my brother tried to reach me, she altered the meaning before it reached me. And she did the same thing to him, in the other direction, in his room, with his door closed. I didn't know that yet. For more than 20 years, I lived as if I were the child nobody had chosen, never knowing my brother had been taught to believe the same thing about me. That was the wound beneath everything that followed. I grew up certain my own brother saw me as a burden, and I built my adult life around never needing anyone. As far as I could tell, the people who were supposed to love me had quietly agreed that I was too much. I did not understand how that belief had been built. I simply carried it into adulthood and spent years trying not to become the disappointment my mother already treated me as. By my late 20s, I had chosen work my family found embarrassing, nothing they could easily brag about. I fell in love with sound, specifically with sitting across from someone, asking the right quiet question, and recording something true they had never said aloud. I started recording oral histories, mostly with older people in the mountain towns around Asheville, North Carolina. I'd knock on a door with a second-hand recorder and a pair of headphones patched with electrical tape. And I'd come out 3 hours later with a war story, a love story, a confession, a life. My family called it a hobby, then a phase. When I was still doing it at 32 and barely making rent, they began calling it pathetic. My mother had a particular way of asking about my work that made it sound like a diagnosis. "And how's the little tape recorder business, she'd say. And then she'd move on before I answered, because the answer was never the point. To understand what Blue Ridge Voices later meant to me, you need to see the life surrounding that work before anyone outside my family valued it. I had a studio apartment where the radiator knocked all night. I owned a good microphone and almost nothing else. I ran 3 kinds of work at once: transcription jobs, weekend shifts at a coffee roaster, and oral history recordings that usually paid nothing but consumed most of my remaining time. My headphones were patched with electrical tape because I could not afford to replace them. I kept a folder on my desk of interviews I'd recorded for free, for neighbors, for people who just wanted their mother's voice kept somewhere safe. Nobody paid for those. I did them anyway because they were the only work that ever felt like it mattered. Most calls from my family began with something they needed. My mother would call to ask me to drive her to an appointment, and I'd rearrange my whole day, and on the drive she'd tell me about Travis, how well he was doing, how proud she was, how she just wished I'd found my footing the way he had. Travis and I barely spoke. When we did, it was in the family group text, where he was clipped and cold, and I was clipped and cold back, both of us performing the distance we'd been assigned. Then, late in 2024, one of those unpaid recordings reached the right person. A woman named Nadine Kessler heard one of my free recordings. She ran the Swannanoa Heritage Society, a tiny nonprofit, 2 rooms, and a leaky roof dedicated to keeping the history of the valley. Someone had played her a piece I'd made for an older man in the community, describing the 1977 flood that took his family's farm. Nadine called me. She said she'd listened to it 3 times. She said she'd been trying for years to find someone who could get people to talk like that, and she'd almost given up. "I don't have much money," she told me. "I have a room, some equipment, and a valley full of people whose stories are going to die with them. I want to build an archive. I want to call it Blue Ridge Voices. Would you do it?" I sat in my knocking radiator apartment, and I understood all at once that the thing my family had called worthless was the thing I did better than anything else in the world. I said yes. Then I quit the coffee roaster shift, my only predictable income, to make room for a project offering little money and no guarantee it would last. That night, my mother heard about it through the family and texted me. "Heard you quit another job. When are you going to stop wasting your life on that tape recorder nonsense and grow up?" I turned the phone face down and did not answer. It was the first time I could remember refusing to defend one of my choices to her ever again. The first few months of Blue Ridge Voices were some of the hardest work I'd ever done, and I loved them in a way I didn't yet have words for. I'll give you the shape of it, because the shape is what matters. The first major recording nearly undid me. Nadine introduced me to Earl, a Korean War veteran who had avoided speaking about the war for decades. Near the end of our afternoon together, he told me about a friend he had left behind and never forgiven himself for. When Nadine heard the recording, she cried. I had made something that could outlive both of us. Then a month of preparation disappeared in one phone call when the last living witness to a vanished mill town withdrew from an interview, afraid of airing family business. I sat on my apartment floor and wondered whether my family had been right about the work after all. But I kept going without applause. I taught myself to edit and mix after my transcription work was finished, learning how to remove a room's hum without stripping the warmth from a voice. The hardest skill was still the simplest. Ask the right question, then remain quiet long enough for someone to answer honestly. Waiting was something my family had trained me to do. I released the first episodes as a small podcast, and a local paper gave the project 3 sentences. I reread them until I nearly knew them by heart. Then my only professional recorder failed during an interview with a 90-year-old woman describing her wedding day. The session was lost, and she was unable to reschedule after a fall. I could not afford a replacement, so Nadine loaned me an older recorder from the Heritage Society. "The work isn't the machine," she told me. "The work is you." I needed to hear that, more than she knew. At a family dinner in early 2025, after the podcast had begun drawing local attention, I made the mistake of sounding proud of it. I mentioned the podcast, the paper, Earl's story. The table went quiet the way it always did when I said something good about myself, that held breath before someone changed the subject. And my mother filled the silence. She smiled and said, "That's nice, honey. Travis just got promoted again. Did he tell you?" And the whole table turned toward my brother like flowers toward the sun, and I sat there with Earl's story unfinished, understanding that no version of my success would ever hold the table's attention for long. What I didn't notice, because I wasn't looking, was Travis's face when they praised him. He didn't look proud. He looked tired. He looked like a man holding something heavy that everyone kept adding to. As I was leaving, my mother touched my arm and said softly, "Don't mind your brother. He's having a hard time, and it's easier for him if you're the one struggling." For one confused moment, I felt chosen, as if she had trusted me with a private truth. That was how she worked. She handed one child poison about the other and called it closeness. I drove home, believing she understood me, when she had only given me another reason to resent Travis. Nadine sent several pieces from the archive to Warren Ashby, a veteran producer at the regional public radio program The Long Porch, which aired across 3 states on Sunday mornings, without telling me. And one afternoon I got an email from a name I didn't recognize, with a subject line I've never deleted. It said, "I think this needs to be heard by the whole state." What my family had spent years calling nothing, a professional producer considered worth broadcasting statewide. The Long Porch picked up Blue Ridge Voices in February 2025. It did not make me rich. It gave the work an audience. Earl's voice reached thousands of listeners. A university library asked about preserving the archive, and a few steady contracts finally let me stop choosing between rent and equipment. I replaced what had failed, but kept the headphones patched with electrical tape. And that's when my mother noticed me. Not because I was happy, because I was being seen. She called, and for once, she didn't ask me to drive her anywhere. She wanted to talk about the show. "I've been thinking," she said in the warm voice she used when she wanted something. "Your little project. You should be recording me, the family story. It should be told properly by someone who was actually there, by me, for the grandchildren, for history." I understood even then that she couldn't stand for the story of our family to be told by anyone but her. She'd spent more than 20 years acting as its only author. And here I was, a person whose entire profession was recording what was true. Some part of her must have felt the threat of that, even if she'd never have said so. So she did what she always did. She moved to control it. She would be the subject. She would decide what the records said. She agreed to sit for a series of recorded family history interviews and signed the release for those sessions without much interest in the details. Once the microphone was running, she performed the role she loved most, the mother who had sacrificed everything for ungrateful children. I did not yet know how useful those interviews would become. I simply asked questions and let her answer in her own words. Around the same time, Travis sent a stiff congratulations in the family group text. Guess the tape recorder paid off. I heard contempt in it, because that was how I had been trained to hear him. I typed something cold back. 2 strangers, keeping their distance, exactly as we'd been taught. Then one night in early March, my phone rang after midnight. It was my mother's number, but it wasn't her voice. It was Travis. He hadn't called me directly in years. "Mom's in the hospital," he said. "It's not. She's stable. But it's going to be a few days, and I can't do this alone. Can you come?" I sat up in the dark and said yes, not knowing that 1 week beside my mother's hospital bed would force Travis and me to compare the stories we had believed for most of our lives. The hospital is where the walls came down. My mother's condition was not life-threatening, but it was serious enough to keep her there for most of a week, and someone needed to stay with her. So Travis and I did something we had never done in our adult lives. We shared responsibility. We split the nights and passed each other at shift changes, exhausted and wary. 2 people who had spent more than 20 years believing the other was the enemy. For the first 2 nights, we barely spoke. We were polite the way strangers are polite. But there's something about a hospital at 3 in the morning. The low hum, the bad coffee, the way the fluorescent light strips the performance off of everyone. That makes it hard to keep pretending. On the 3rd night, my mother was asleep, and Travis and I were both in the room, and neither of us had left, and the silence finally cracked. I do not remember what started it. I think I was simply too tired to keep my guard up. Something I had carried for more than 20 years finally came out. I said, not angry, only worn down, "You know, you didn't have to spend our whole lives treating me like a burden." Travis turned toward me, and the guarded expression I had known all my life disappeared. "A burden," he said slowly. "When did I ever call you a burden?" "You didn't have to say it," I said. "Mom told me, for years, that you thought I was too much, that you resented having to share everything with me." He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, very carefully, like a man stepping onto ice, "Brandy, Mom told me that you called me a freeloader, that you thought I was a leech on this family, that you said I'd never make it on my own, and she was ashamed of me." The room got very cold. "I never said that," I whispered. "Travis, I never said any of that. I never even thought it." "I know," he said. "I'm looking at your face. And I know, and I need you to hear me. I never thought you were a burden, not once. I bought you a bracelet when I was 15, and you looked at me like I'd handed you a bill." "She told me you didn't want to give it to me," I said. "She said she forced you." We sat there and began going through it, one memory at a time, speaking quietly so we would not wake her. Every cold moment, every closed door, every insult we had been certain the other one had thrown. It was almost unbearable how neatly the story came apart once we placed our two versions side by side. The bracelet, I told him how she'd handed it to me and said he'd been forced. He told me she'd come to him afterward and said I'd called it cheap, that I'd laughed about it with a friend. Neither was true. We'd both spent years believing a cruelty that had never happened. The night I was 17, crying over the college rejection, he remembered it from the other side. He remembered stepping toward me and being intercepted, and being told later that I'd said I couldn't stand him hovering when I was upset, that I found him smothering. So he'd stopped stepping toward me, for years, because she'd told him kindly, sadly, that his kindness was the thing I couldn't bear. My high school graduation, where he'd stood at the back and left early, I'd been told he had somewhere better to be. He told me she'd said I didn't want him there, that I'd asked her to keep him from making it about himself. So he'd come and stood at the back where he thought I wanted him, and left before he could ruin it. The Christmas he did not call, the time I never visited his first apartment, the wedding invitation that arrived, late and cold. We traced each one back to the same middleman carrying the same message in two directions. He does not want you there. She does not want to hear from you. I am only telling you so you will not be hurt. Every wound led not to each other, but to one voice standing between us and saying, "Not now. Let me handle this." Neither of us had said the things we hated the other for. We had both trusted one translator who had poisoned the message in both directions for more than 20 years. I looked over at my mother, asleep in the hospital bed, small and gray under the blanket, and I felt something I had no name for. It wasn't hate, exactly. It was the floor dropping out. Everything I understood about my own life was being rewritten in real time, in the dark, next to the person who'd written the original. Travis reached across the space between our chairs and took my hand. We'd never done that. Not as adults. Maybe not ever. And we sat like that, two people who'd been robbed of each other, holding on in a hospital room while the thief slept 6 feet away. And almost immediately, the fear came. "We can't say anything," Travis said quietly. "You know that, right? If we confront her, she'll deny all of it. She'll cry. She'll say we're ganging up on her. She'll turn it into us attacking a sick woman who only ever loved us." He was right. I knew it the way you know the shape of a room you grew up in. Any direct accusation would end with her as the victim, and the two of us as monsters attacking a sick woman. She had more than 20 years of practice and rarely left a fingerprint. There was nothing written down. There were only 2 adult children who had finally compared notes, and against her tears, the family might still choose her version. Meanwhile, I was learning what the promotion and praise had actually cost my brother. Travis had been the family's golden child, the one held up at every dinner, but the role had been a cage rather than a crown. Our mother had shaped him into an extension of herself and cut him off from the one person who might have understood him, me. Meredith had moved out that winter. He was burned out at a job he had chosen largely because it sounded impressive when our mother described it to her friends. He had spent his life performing success until the performance emptied him out, while every public compliment made it harder for him to admit that the life beneath it was collapsing around him. Sitting in that hospital, I watched the man I had been taught to see as cold and superior turn out to be as lonely and used as I was. We were the same wound, pointed in opposite directions. "I don't want the rest of our lives to look like the last 2 decades," he said. "I can't." So we made a decision there in the dark. We would not confront her with memories she could deny. We would give her an opportunity to repeat the same behavior in a way we could prove. Our mother could resist logic, evidence, and tears that were not her own, but she could never resist being the sole keeper of a secret. That was how she had controlled us, by deciding what everyone supposedly thought and said, then carrying those messages between us. "So, we give her one," I said. "One secret that no one outside the 2 of us knows, and one she will want to use." I leaned toward my brother and began explaining the trap. "You have to remember what I did for a living. My mother had voluntarily agreed to recorded family history interviews, and I had spent years learning how to ask quiet questions while people revealed more than they intended. But the trap itself would not depend on hidden equipment or a release she had barely read. It would depend on her repeating, in her own words, the behavior she had always denied. I wanted the trap to prove one specific thing. We would create the opportunity, but we would not tell her what to say, whom to tell, or how to twist it. Every lie beyond the secret itself would be hers. Here is what we did. A few days after she came home, I sat with my mother alone, the way she liked it, just the 2 of us, her favorite configuration, mother and confidant, and I told her a secret. I invented an offer connected to Blue Ridge Voices, a senior producer position, and a $60,000 grant. None of it was real. It only needed to sound specific enough for her to repeat. I told her I was thrilled, and then I lowered my voice and I asked her to do me a favor. Using the wording Travis and I had agreed on, I said, "Please don't tell him. He's having a hard time after Meredith left, and I want to tell him myself when the time is right. Just between us, okay?" She squeezed my hand. She said, of course. She said she understood that Travis had always been sensitive, that it would be our little secret. Her eyes were already somewhere else. I could see the information settling into her like a stone dropping into a well. Outside the 2 of us who had designed the test, Loretta was the only person I told. If the story spread through the family, we would know which route it had taken. It would not prove every old memory by itself, but it would prove the pattern still existed. I would be the only person outside our plan to tell Loretta, and if the story returned through someone else, she could no longer claim that Travis and I had imagined the message passing through her. Travis worried about it at first. "What if she just doesn't take the bait?" he asked me on the phone. "What if she keeps it to herself?" "She might keep it," I said. "If she does, we learn nothing and stop there. But every pattern we've compared says she'll use it to move us against each other. We wait and see." I was calmer about it than I had any right to be. I think that's because, for the first time, I wasn't guessing about my mother. I was reading her the way I read the people across my microphone. Not by what I wanted them to be, but by the pattern of what they'd always been. And her pattern was as fixed as a fingerprint. Then Travis and I waited. During our scheduled family history interviews, Loretta continued speaking into the microphone she had knowingly agreed to use. When I asked about the family, she began describing Travis as jealous of my success and quoted cruel remarks he had supposedly made about me. Travis had never said them. Without prompting, she was recreating the same false translator role in a recorded interview she knew was being preserved. And then the trap sprang in the way we had feared and expected. About a week after I told her the secret, Loretta called Travis directly. She said she was worried about me. Then she told him I had received a large grant, had become arrogant, and had supposedly said he was a failure who would never amount to anything. Travis asked her to repeat what I had said. She did, adding details I had never given her. Because he was part of the conversation, he recorded his own call with her and sent it to me afterward. She had taken the false secret Travis and I had placed with her, attached an invented attack on my brother, and delivered both directly to him. She had repeated the false opportunity we designed and built the cruelty around it herself, exactly as the old pattern predicted. She'd built it herself out of nothing, the way she'd built everything for more than 20 years, and this time she'd done it into a recording, and she had no idea that both of her children were finally standing on the same side of the wall. "We have it," Travis said. "Brandy, we actually have it." I sat down on my floor, on the same spot where I'd once thought this work was nothing, and I held the phone, and I listened to my brother's voice shaking with something that wasn't quite grief and wasn't quite relief. For the first time, he had independent proof that our mother was still inventing messages and carrying them between us. I put my hand over my mouth. More than 20 years, and the fingerprint she'd never once left was finally on something we could hold. But we didn't confront her. We put the recordings somewhere safe. I made copies of the originals, the way Warren had once taught me to protect anything that mattered, and we did nothing. We waited because confronting her privately would only trigger denial. Given her history, I suspected she would eventually use the story before a larger audience, where it could do more damage and make her appear protective. In the weeks after coming home from the hospital, my mother did exactly what I expected. She turned her illness into a spotlight and pointed it at herself. She announced a big Mother's Day gathering, the whole family, everyone, all the relatives, and she framed it in the one way that made refusal impossible. "After the winter I've had, I don't know how many more gatherings like this I can count on," she told everyone, hand to her chest. "I just want us all together, one time, while I'm still here. Guilt is the most reliable engine a person like my mother has, and she ran the whole family on it. Nobody comes to an ordinary Mother's Day for a cousin they see twice a year, but everybody comes when a woman who was just in the hospital says she wants to see your face while she still can. They came for the guilt. She'd built herself a stage and filled the seats without anyone realizing she'd done it. And then she came to me privately, and she delivered the ultimatum, though she'd never have called it that. She told me it was time to grow up, time to stop playing radio and think about the family. She said Travis was struggling and accused me of flaunting the grant she believed I had received. She ordered me to come to dinner, make peace publicly, and stop embarrassing the family. I did not correct the invented story or defend myself. She said a good daughter would put the family first. She said she'd sacrificed her whole life for us, and the least I could do was stop embarrassing everyone. "I only want you children to love each other," she said, and her eyes were wet, and I swear to you she believed it. That was the thing I finally understood about her. She wasn't a villain twirling a mustache. She genuinely believed that the two of us loving each other more than we needed her was a kind of betrayal. She wanted me to come back to my assigned role, the difficult daughter who existed to make everyone else look good by comparison. And she wanted me to do it in front of the whole family, on her day, as her gift. I told her I'd be there. I didn't argue. I let her think she'd won, because a woman who thinks she's won builds a bigger stage. Then, Travis and I got ready. We didn't tell anyone. We didn't warn a soul. I wanted her own voice in the middle of the table so the family could recognize the contradiction without either of us asking them to choose a side. We didn't plan a speech. We planned to let her perform, all the way to the end, and then to play her own voice back to her in front of the people she'd performed for. I loaded both recordings onto a small handheld recorder, not a phone, on purpose, something plain and physical that I could set on a table like a piece of evidence, because I wanted it to be an object, something they could all look at. We were careful in a way that surprised even me. Travis kept asking if we should warn Aunt Colleen or one of the cousins, get someone on our side ahead of time. I said no. The moment we recruited an ally, it became our word plus theirs against hers. And that was exactly the kind of fight she knew how to win. The he said, she said, the family taking sides. I didn't want a side. I wanted evidence the family could hear for themselves, without being told whom to believe. If they figured it out themselves, she could never call it a conspiracy. She could only call it what it was. The night before Mother's Day, I sat alone in my apartment. The radiator still knocked. Some things I'd kept on purpose, too. I got out the old headphones, the ones with the electrical tape on the band, the ones I'd carried through every version of myself, and I put them on, and I listened one more time to my mother's voice, calm and warm and certain, describing a daughter who didn't exist and a son who'd never said the things she gave him credit for. I'd spent my whole life recording other people's truth. Strangers had trusted me with the realest things they'd ever said. And in more than 20 years, I had never turned that same attention on my own family, because I'd been too busy believing the version of us she'd recorded over the top of the real one. Tomorrow, for the first time, my mother would hear her own voice played back as evidence in front of the family she had controlled with it. I put the recorder in my bag. I turned off the light. Sunday, May 11th, 2025, Mother's Day. I told you where this started, so you know how the room looked. Full table, cousins and Aunt Colleen and my mother's two friends who came every year to watch her be adored. Ham, green beans, and a lemon cake she repeatedly reminded everyone she had baked, despite the difficult winter she'd survived. She waited until the meal was almost done, until the wine had softened everyone, until the room was hers, and then she set down her fork and she began to cry, softly, and she told them all that it broke her heart to say it, but her daughter had come into money and turned cruel. That I looked down on all of them now, that I'd said terrible things about my own brother, called him a failure, said he'd never amount to anything. She let it fill the room. Then she looked up, wet-eyed, and asked us, please to stop fighting. From the end of the table, Travis played the role Loretta expected. He set down his fork and said, so proud of herself over her pocket change. The relatives smiled that comfortable smile. Aunt Colleen looked at her napkin. My mother touched her chest and made the small wounded sound. I didn't defend myself. I reached into my bag, and I set the recorder on the table, next to the salt. And I looked at my mother, and I said, let's end this act, Mom. Then I pressed play. Her voice came through the speaker from the call she had made directly to Travis. Warm, certain, unmistakably hers. Brandy's gotten so arrogant since the money. She told me herself that she thinks you're a failure, that you'll never amount to anything. She looks down on this whole family now. The room didn't understand at first. You could see it. They heard her voice saying the things she'd just said at the table, and for a second, it didn't compute. And then it began to, slowly, on face after face. They were hearing Loretta quote a private conversation that had never happened, using details from a secret brandy and Travis knew had been invented solely for the test. Travis stood up. He walked the length of the table, and he came and stood beside me. And he said quietly, so the whole room had to lean in to hear it. She said those words directly to me on that call. She has also been telling Brandy, during recorded interviews, that I said cruel things about her that I never said. She gave each of us a different lie and used herself as the only messenger between us. My mother's face had gone the color of the tablecloth. You edited that, she said. You cut that together. That's not... It's your voice, Mom, Travis said. You know it is. Everyone here knows it is. And then I asked her the question we'd built the whole thing around. I didn't raise my voice. I just looked at her and I said, that offer and grant never existed. Travis and I invented them together, and you were the only other person I told. So why did you call him, repeat the secret, and attach words I never said? The silence that followed was the loudest thing I've ever heard, because they were all doing the math. I could watch it move around the table. A secret created by two people had been handed to one intended target, and Loretta had immediately used it to manufacture conflict between them. There was only one route by which the invented secret could have traveled from me to Travis. Loretta's voice. The same voice on the recorder. The same voice that had, for 20 years, been the only one carrying messages between two children who'd never actually spoken to each other in anger at all. Aunt Colleen looked at her sister, and recognition moved across her face. Not surprise, but the expression of someone seeing an old suspicion finally given proof. Like a suspicion she'd swallowed for decades had finally been set on the table next to the salt. My mother looked around the room for the faces that always softened for her, the ones that always came to her defense. And for the first time in her life, she didn't find them. She found people staring at their plates, at each other, at her, doing the arithmetic and coming up with an answer they couldn't unknow. For years, Loretta had acted as the only author of our family. Now her own voice had exposed how she wrote the story. Let's end this act, Mom, I said again, gently this time, and I reached over and I pressed stop. The guests left quickly. There's a particular way people leave when they've seen something they'll be talking about for years and can't stand to be in the room with it a second longer. Coates, murmured thank yous, no eye contact with the woman who'd made the cake. Over the next half hour, the room emptied until only Loretta, Travis, me, and Aunt Colleen remained. My mother turned on us the moment the door closed, and she ran through every weapon she had, one after another, faster and faster. First, denial. That recording was doctored. I never said any of that. You've always had a vivid imagination, Brandy. Everyone knows that about you. She stopped when she heard herself, because reaching for my old reputation, the difficult daughter, in this room now, only proved the point. Then blame. If I ever said anything, it was because I was trying to protect you both. You don't know what it was like, raising two children alone, keeping this family together. Everything I did for you. Then, the plea. Her voice broke, and the tears came, and she reached toward me. I'm your mother, after everything. I was in the hospital this winter, and you'd do this to me? I only have you two. You're all I have left. I let the silence sit. I'd learned that from her, actually, the power of the pause. But I used it differently than she ever had. A person can say the wrong thing once, I finally said. That's a mistake. I've made them. Everyone has. I looked at her. But you didn't do this once. You carried false messages between us for more than 20 years, every time choosing control over letting us speak to each other. That's not a mistake, Mom. A mistake is an accident. This was a pattern you kept choosing. She didn't have an answer for that. For the first time in my life, my mother had no answer. From the doorway, Aunt Colleen spoke, and her voice was thin. "I knew," she said. "God help me. I think I always knew something was wrong. The way you two never... The way she always had a reason you couldn't be in a room together." She looked at me and Travis, and her eyes were full. I told myself it wasn't my business. For more than 20 years, I told myself it wasn't my business. I'm so sorry. I should have said something when you were children. And here is the thing I want you to understand, because it's the truest part. Her apology didn't fix anything. It came more than 20 years too late, and that much lost time does not buy back a childhood. But it was real, and it was honest, and it was more than my mother had ever given me. I nodded at her. I didn't say it was okay, because it wasn't, but I let her know I'd heard her. Sometimes that's all you can do with an apology that arrives after the damage is permanent. Receive it, and refuse to pretend it undoes anything. I turned back to my mother. "I'm not going to scream at you," I said. "I am not making a permanent decision about our relationship tonight. But I am done performing the role you assigned me, and I am setting one boundary now." I picked up the recorder from where it still sat on the table. "You don't get to tell our story anymore. Not mine, not Travis's, not to us, and not to anyone else. That job is over. You're not the author of this family. You never should have been." She started to cry again. Real this time, or maybe not. I honestly couldn't tell anymore. And I'd stopped needing to know. And that was the strangest freedom of all, realizing I no longer had to figure out whether her tears were real, because I was no longer going to organize my life around them either way. Travis and I walked out together. In the driveway, in the last of the evening light, he stopped and looked at me. My brother, the stranger I'd lived beside for 34 years. "I'm sorry," he said, "for believing them. For all those years, I'm so sorry." "You didn't believe them," I said. "You believed her. So did I. That's what she counted on." And I put on my arms around my brother, and he held on, and neither of us said anything else, because we didn't have to. We had finally stopped being enemies, and the power she had built on keeping us divided could not survive that. It's October 2025 now, 5 months after Mother's Day. I want to leave you where I actually am, not where the drama peaked, because the peak was never the point. Blue Ridge Voices now has a permanent home at the university, which means Earl's voice, the flood, and 100 other lives will remain accessible long after all of us are gone. I have a small team now. 2 young people who are better at the technical work than I'll ever be, and a real room to work in, with good light. The long porch still runs our pieces. I make a living now, not a fortune, I want to be honest. This was never a story about money, but a living. At the exact thing my family spent a decade calling nothing. I started seeing a therapist in the summer. I'm learning the difference between being alone and being free, which turns out to be a real difference, and a big one. Travis is rebuilding, slowly. He left the job that had been draining him and is doing something quieter now, something he chose for himself. He and I try to have dinner every week, just the 2 of us. We are learning who the other person actually is, more than 20 years late. And some nights we laugh so hard about how completely we were fooled that we have to stop and catch our breath, and some nights it's not funny at all, and we sit with that too. My mother sent a letter a few weeks ago. I read it. It was 3 pages written in the shape of an apology, but buried in the middle was a sentence explaining that she'd only done what she thought was best, and that none of this would have happened if we had understood her better. So, an apology that was still underneath my fault. I set it down. I didn't answer it right away, and I might not answer it at all, and I've made my peace with not knowing yet. An apology you're handed isn't a debt you have to pay. I get to decide what it's worth and when and whether. That's mine now. Last Sunday, Travis came over. I took out the handheld recorder I had placed on the table on Mother's Day and set it between us on the kitchen counter. Not to catch anyone, not to prove anything, just to keep something true. And I asked my brother to tell me about a day from our childhood, one he actually remembered, in his own words, with no one standing between us to translate it into something it wasn't. And he did. And we got it exactly the way it really happened, the two of us, on the record at last. I spent my whole life recording other people's stories while I lived inside a version of my own that somebody else had written over the top of. I don't anymore. The story is mine now. I am surviving it, rebuilding a life from the parts of myself my family taught me to dismiss, and I no longer need any of them to tell me what I'm worth, not even her. If someone ever made you the villain of their story, or divided you from a person you might have loved because they needed to remain between you, I hope you found, or still find, your way back to the facts. If you're willing to share, who taught you the story you once believed about yourself, and what happened when you finally checked it against the truth?